So we've talked a little bit about layout using CSS. Now, a really important concept in terms of layout is how it should change depending on the size of the screen. Because these days there are many different screen sizes: desktops, laptops, iPads, mobile phones, and we want our website to look good on all of them. And in order to do that, we need to make our websites responsive, so it responds to the changes in the screen size. The next time you go onto the web, I want you to try and change the size of your window. So grab one of the sides or grab one of the corners and simply move it so that we change the width of the screen. And what I want you to notice is how the website responds to that. Notice how here in my full width, you can see all of these things up here, the different parts of the navigation bar. But when I make this a little bit narrower, you'll see that at some point it suddenly will disappear. And where has it gone? Well, it's gone into a menu now. So if you're on an iPad or if you're on an iPhone where there's not enough width to display all of these items, then it gets collapsed into a little menu system, which is really neat, right? And at various points of the width, for example, right about here, you can see the navigation bar collapse and go into a menu. And then if we go even further, you can see that search button even disappears, so that on mobile, maybe you're not able to use that search bar very well. So they've hidden it on this particular size. Have a look at your favorite websites and see how they're designed to be responsive, and come back and I'll show you how we can do it as well. There are 4 main ways of doing this. One is through the use of what's called media queries, and then there is CSS Grid, CSS Flexbox, and you can also get really good responsiveness by using external frameworks such as Bootstrap. So we're going to talk about all 3 of these in this lesson. The first one is the media query, and this is essentially something that you put in instead of a selector in your CSS. As you remember, this is normally the part before the curly braces where you add your selector, your .class or your ID, but instead we use an @ and then the word media, and afterwards we have some brackets and we add in a breakpoint. This essentially says that look inside these braces to apply the CSS when you are displaying the website on a screen that is below or equal to 600 pixels wide. Here we've set the max width to 600, and everything that is up to that size will have a different CSS, which we can define in here. And this is how a media query works. It's pretty simple. We can define various different widths. Coming back to here, notice how when we go from this width to this width, there is a breakpoint right there that changes the display and tells the navigation bar to have a different CSS layout. So we could do exactly that using media queries. Now, another common method for creating responsiveness is through something called CSS Grid. This is a little bit harder to understand, which is why we're dedicating a whole section to teaching you about it. But it also means that it's a lot more flexible. So you could create any of these designs. But let's say we pick one of these, for example, this layout right here, and we want to do that on our website. Well, we could use CSS Grid by simply creating a div that contains 5 divs. So notice there's 5 squares here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And each of these divs are given a class called card, but the containing div gets a different style. And we apply the display grid to the containing div. So this is going to be applied to this one right here. And remember previously we learned about display and we saw how it could be inline, it could be block, it could be none. And in this case, if we set it to grid, then we're basically saying that we're going to use this system of CSS Grid to do the layout. And CSS Grid is a pretty simple system where you can define how you want the columns and rows to be laid out. If we go to the next line here, let me talk you through it. So here we're saying that we're going to have some columns in our grid where we're going to have 2 columns. So there are 2 bits here that I've defined, and they're both 1 fraction. What this says is we want 2 columns, 1 and 2, and on our website we would create these 2 columns, 1 and 2. And what the FR stands for is to make it an equal fraction. 1 and 2 basically have the same width, and it's just divided the screen into 2 columns. The next line, if we look at this, says we should also create some rows in our grid. And because there are 3 different values here, then we're creating 1, 2, and 3 rows. And we're creating these rows a little bit differently from our columns. Now we could do the same thing. We could have 3 equal size columns, or we could use fractions to figure out maybe one has to be twice as big as the other, but we can also define it simply in terms of pixels. And for rows, you'll often see this. So what we said is that the top row should have 100 pixels in height. The next one should be 200 pixels in height. And the next one is also 200 pixels. CSS Grid, as you can see, is an incredibly flexible way of creating very complex layout very quickly. And if we go to the next line, this gap basically says that there should be a gap of 30 pixels between each of the rows and the columns, which you'll see right here and right here. Now, finally, we can change the first div here, which has a class of first, which we target right here, so that we make the column span 2 columns. So now instead of just being a single column like the rest of these, which is 1 column width, this one is spanning 2 of the columns on our grid, and our entire website only has 2 columns, so it makes it go full width basically to achieve this layout. Maybe we'll put a header in there, maybe we'll put a big heading, maybe we'll put some big text, etc. And this complex layout is very easily done using just 5-6 lines of code using CSS Grid. Now we're going to be diving much deeper into CSS Grid, and I'm going to be showing you and walking you through a lot of the different features, but we're going to be dedicating a whole section to it. So don't worry if you don't fully understand it right now. I just want to show you quickly how it would work. Similarly, I want to show you another powerful system that's often used, which is called Flexbox. And this, again, is a big system, which we're going to dive deep into. But for now, I just want you to get a quick overview and a brief understanding of how it works. If grid is something that applies to 2D layouts, where you've got columns and you've got rows, then what Flexbox is really good at is allowing you to create 1D layouts, whether if you want everything laid out as boxes on the horizontal, or if you want everything laid out vertically as boxes on the vertical, then you're probably going to be using Flexbox for this. So here's another simple demo. We've got a div container that contains 4 divs, and you can see them right here, 1, 2, 3, and 4. If we make the parent container, so similar to last time where we made it use a display of grid, but instead this time we use a display of flex, then we're saying to the CSS that we're using this Flexbox system. And what the system then allows us to do is to set each of the divs inside the Flex container. So notice we're targeting each of these cards here, and we can give them different settings. Let's say that for all of them, by default, we want them to have a flex of 1. So what this does is it makes each of these cards have an equal width distribution. So divide up the width equally between these 4 cards. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now I've added a fixed height of 100 pixels. So each of these cards should all have 100 pixels in height. But then I've gone and done some customizations to the default layout that's set out here. What I've done is I've added some extra classes to the first two divs. This first div has, instead of a flex of 1 where it has equal width to everybody else, I've set it to have a flex of 2. So what this means is this is going to be twice the width of each of these unmodified ones. And then for the second card here, I've set the flex to be 0.5. So this should have half the width of the normal cards. And by using that flex property, I've managed to set up a very complex width ratio to create this particular layout that I wanted. And as you can imagine, if we were working with float, margin, and all of these things that we've learned about, it would be possible, but a lot more complicated to achieve this. And you can use this really flexible system with Flexbox to determine how you want the layout to be laid out horizontally. So maybe you could have a navigation bar on the right, which is flex of 1, and then you have a main content that's flex of 3. So then this is 3 times the width of this one. But alternatively, you can flex in this direction. So maybe you want a heading section that is a flex of 1, and then you have the main content here, which is a flex of 3, and then you have a footer, which is also a 1. So then it's going to divide up the total height that you have on the web page. So in this case, we have 5 units, and then divide it up according to what you've set for the flex. So again, this is a more complex layout system, which we're going to dive into and we're going to learn more about. But essentially, in terms of the gist, it's just about dividing up the width or dividing up the height based on these ratios that you provide. And because everything is a ratio and a percentage, then that means it is by default responsive. Because if this width changes, then everything is going to change proportionally. So none of these will have a fixed width, like say 400 pixels or something. But instead, it's going to work that number out based on what the total width is, because it's a percentage of the total width. Now, the very last method of creating responsiveness that I want to talk about is using the Bootstrap framework. And the reason why it's called a framework is because it's external. So it's not something that's built into CSS like Grid or Flexbox, but it's actually something that we have to bring in, so other people's code that we're going to use. And essentially what they've done is they've defined a whole bunch of classes in their CSS. So they've written extensive amounts of CSS, and they've put different rules for different selectors. For example, you could have something called card, you could have something called row, and you could have something called container. And these all will point to some CSS code inside the Bootstrap container, which has predefined layout. For example, here I've got 3 cards, and notice how they've all got rounded corners and how they have a specific type of font, and all of that styling is applied automatically to your code by simply putting in the Bootstrap framework and then adding a particular class name. Now, in terms of responsiveness, they also have a sort of flex system, because Bootstrap is in fact built on top of Flexbox. Now, their system is a 12 division system. So let me explain this. If the full width of your website can be divided into 12 equal portions, so then you have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Now, if you count these, you'll find that there are 12 little sections, and they divide up the entire website. Now you can say, if I want a particular div that is going to take up half of the width, then I can use this class called col-6, so column-6. And it's basically going to take up 6 of these columns right here, so 6 of these little sections. And as you can see, this first card indeed does take up 6 of the sections. Now I can create other cards in here. So this one's going to take up 2 of the columns, and this one's going to take up 4 of the columns. And added together, they add up to 12, which means that it's going to take up the entire width. So we've now got 3 cards taking up the entire width of the website. But as we resize the website, then it's going to respond. So a column 6 is going to be a 50% width. If the width was 1000 pixels, then this one is going to be 500 pixels wide. If the width was 2000 pixels, then the width will be 1000 pixels, etc. And this is not only really good for responsiveness, but it's also really good because I mentioned we can get styling brought into our website really easily just by using some of the pre-built components that comes with this framework. Similar to Grid, Flexbox, we're going to be doing a section on Bootstrap as well, so that you can learn more about this system and all of the features that are available to you once you understand how it works. But these are some of the main ways that we can create responsive websites very easily in our web design using CSS. In the next lesson, I'm going to dive deeper into media queries because it's a relatively easy to understand system and it's not as complex as some of these 3, which we'll need to dedicate an individual section to and quite a lot of time to. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, well, there are all these different methods and they all seem great, but which one is the best? And which one should I choose? This is often such a common question I get from students. And I want to say to you that there is no such thing as the best when it comes to any sort of programming. These are just tools. And they could be tools like a hammer or a chisel or a drill. They all have different specialities. They're all good at different things, basically. And as you'll see in the coming lessons, where we get to learn a little bit more about each of these different styles of creating responsiveness and adding layout to our websites, they all have strengths and weaknesses. So keep an open mind, and all that you need to know for this lesson is just to realize that there are many different ways of creating responsive websites, and these are the most common ways. There's quite a lot of demo code that I showed you in this lesson, and I want you to be able to play around with it because you're really only going to learn code when you actually try and make mistakes and change things and mess with things in order to see how it works. So download 8.2 responsiveness from this lesson and then open it up inside VS Code. If you go into the index.html and show it as a preview, you can see all the different ways that we can create responsiveness. And then go to the media query HTML to see how we've used media queries in order to achieve this kind of breakpoint responsiveness. And then maybe go back and try a different method like CSS Grid and see how our grid is responsiveness, but again, done using a different method. And the same with Flexbox or Bootstrap, and just examine some of the code and play around with it or change things. I know right now you don't have complete information because we haven't gone into this in detail yet, but just get a feel of how it might work and see how its responsiveness, test it out. So I'll leave you to do that, and then once you're done, head over back here and we'll go into the next lesson where we're going to learn more about media queries in detail. For all of that and more, I'll see you there.